In the previous video, I've shown photographs of the village of Rugy that carry my name, or that I carry its name, I guess, a better way. But now I'd like to talk about the early inhabitants that came there, just a brief history of it so that you get a flavor of some of the background. So I'm going to start with a brief description of the topography of the region. Rugy is located on the plateau of Langres, which is in a large area called Haute-Marne region of France. From this plateau flow three rivers, one to the north and to the ocean, one to the English Channel, and another one to the east to the Saône, and then the Rhine, and eventually the Mediterranean. These rivers gather up a lot of small, tumbling and active streams for their nourishment. The elevation is moderate, from roughly 1,000 to 1,300 feet, and the weather, of course, is, as I mentioned earlier, moderate. I was there in the 70s when they enjoyed their first snowfall in 50 years. There is an earthquake recorded around the AD 1000 that was pretty severe, but other than that, it's a relatively calm strata. Abbot Mosen recorded in his history of the region there's considerable evidence that people had settled in that region 40,000 years ago. He says that around 1000 BC the Celtic tribes arrived from the east and settled in the region. They were Druids who sacrificed human lives in worshipping of their gods. And they were warriors and craftsmen, and they shared the land with the existing inhabitants and intermingled. The country now known as France was originally known as Gaul, according to Caesar, who invaded around 51 BC. The earliest known history, for certain, is around 800 BC, when artifacts from the Etruscans lived in the Alps north of Italy and formed part of Italy's original population. Artifacts from these people have been found around Rugy, indicating that there was trade and settlement in that region, certainly by that time. Numerous historians have numerous theories of where those people came from originally prior to that, and I guess the general agreement is that they came from the Near East and Africa and the Caucasus and other regions, and gradually immigrated from there toward the western part of the continent. In any case, there's no certain way of knowing this, but there certainly is a mixture of the DNA, and of course we know that the Neanderthals were probably the first settlers in that region, and some people still carry some traces of the DNA in their makeup. In fact, I know several people personally that have a small percentage, 3 or 4% of Neanderthal DNA in their blood, and their ancestors, some of the ancestors that they have came from the Caucasus, Carpathian, and that eastern region of Europe, where those Neanderthals apparently survived into the nearer times which we live, and intermarried with the invading tribes. So anyway, there's a lot of history about it, and a lot of reading that can be done, but generally the history of that time is practically zero. Sometime before Christ, a leader of a canton, as it was known, or a small tribe, eventually came into the valley of the Amas, which is where the village of Rugy now exists, along with 39 other villages. Anyway, this leader apparently decided to settle where the village of Rugy is located, and the spelling of his name from the Celtic records at that time was Robiac. And of course, over time, with the introduction of the Romans and the Latin and so forth, it eventually evolved into Rougeux, which is its current spelling, and of course mine. The paragraph below this listing of
the various names of Rougy. In a few words, states that in 1789, because of the dismemberment of the nearby parish at Chaumont, to which Rougy submitted its tithes, will now submit its tithes and relationship to coffee. Their church, dedicated as the Assumption, was formerly a subject of Horts, Diocese of Langres, and County of Pierrefitte. Among the materials that my friend Francois Geoffrain sent me were two historical narratives of the region written by two abbots of the Bellevue Monastery that's owned Rougy for a number of centuries, and only a mile or so over the hill from the village itself. As an aside, I have some pictures of the remains of that monastery that was established around 1100 A.D., about a mile over the hill from Rougy. I think you'll find these kind of interesting. The first narrative was written in roughly the 1700s by an abbot who used ancient documents as his source of information, some dating back to 800, and he used them verbatim, basically word for word from the originals, and he compiled his history on that source of information. However, a large part of that history was written originally in the archaic French, which is substantially different than the French spoken today. And that language was called the langue d'oreille, or the language of the ear. And it persisted into roughly the 13th century when it morphed into the current structure and pronunciation. So when I got that material, I attempted to translate it, but I couldn't find any dictionaries on the material I had, so I gave it up. And I went to the second book written around 1850 or so, and that abbot used contemporary French, and he wrote it originally from his own research and so forth. So that I was able to translate relatively easily, and I wrote the book, The Long Journey, based on that and other research that I had done. A few years after the publication of The Long Journey, I was back in Frenchville on a vacation, and I attended the Frenchville picnic there, which began in 1860 as an annual event. So I really didn't know very many people. I've been gone for 50 or 60 years from the area, but I was sitting in the shade there in the pine wood, and a fellow came up to me and he said, I know who you are. And he was about my age, and we began to talk, and sure enough, his name was Adrian Sears, and he was a retired gunnery sergeant from the Marines after having spent 30 years in the service with them and served during World War II. Now, I hadn't seen him since the mid-40s when he came home on a leave. So we really had an interesting and animated conversation, and I told him about what I was doing and the impossibility of translating this first history, which I really wanted to do, but I already exhausted every attempt. I'd sent copies to Pennsylvania State and Montreal, college up there, and I couldn't find anybody that knew how to do it, to translate it. I even had a cousin who was a professor at Penn State. He specialized in the French language. So I told him about it, and he said, oh gosh, just send it up, I'll do it for you. And it wasn't long before I had a telephone call, and he sheepishly admitted that he couldn't do it. He had no way of translating it. My friend Adrian told me that he was stationed in Washington, D.C. at one time in his career, and one afternoon he was walking down the sidewalk in the subdivision, and he spotted this yard sale. So he just stopped, and he saw this old French dictionary for sale, and he bought it for 50 cents. And he said, if you want it, you can have it. Maybe it'll help you. It had crushed flowers between a number of the leaves and some interesting notations in the margins of some pages and so forth. I really like this little book, even though it was a real beast to use. It provided the key to the whole project. I could see that there were a lot of words in it that I didn't understand, but I hoped that it would help. So I brought it home and I decided I didn't want to tackle it, that translation. So I put it up on a shelf. A couple of years later, Adrian died, and it brought back the recollection of having a dictionary, so I decided to try to tackle a translation of my material. And after about 6 or 8 weeks of really intense effort, and I can tell you it was intense and brutal, I had to look up almost every word of those 62,000 words. But I managed to get a definition of the word and get it in the context of what the author of the book was trying to say. And put together and published as a survival. Survival deals with the people and recounts endless incidences and, well, the history of the region from the peasant standpoint. Whereas most histories, including The Long Journey, are based on more of the events that the rulers did in their episodes and so forth. So I found the second translation much more informative in that sense that it told about the daily life of the peasants 1,000 years ago. It's really a terrible story of privation and famines and, well, it's just endless. It's surprising that any survived. Certainly survived long enough to emigrate to central Pennsylvania. I'm just going to mention a couple of events that I recorded in this book. There's one case where the famine and the food shortage was so severe that the people were forced to eat grass. And one day a woman and her little child were found dead in front of the church there at Rougy. And she had grass remains in her mouth, but they couldn't survive on it. And there were endless bands of criminals that roamed the countryside and burned and robbed and raped. And in one case, well, actually in 2 cases, human feces were spread over the interior walls of 2 churches, one in Horts, right near Rougy. Priests burned the thing down to get rid of the contamination, and it was so terrific. The bands would steal the horses that were there, or the oxen, and the farmers then were forced to pull the plow themselves. There were groups of men that would go around from farm to farm offering to do that work in place of the horses. It wasn't a choice, really. These 3 summaries of the vicissitudes in 3 succeeding centuries are terrible recountings of the lives of our ancestors. And this was not only in France, but the other neighboring countries in England too. If you look at the 16th century, the famine started in 1648. The second one that century started in 1621-48 and lasted to 1649, 1650, 1651, and 1652 before it ended. And of course there was another one in 1694. But how those people survived those years without sufficient food, it's amazing if there's any survivors at all. The mortality rate was really horrendous. And the lawlessness must have increased exponentially because people would do anything to get food. So the terror and the terrible lifestyle that famine forced upon the people was unbelievable. we can't imagine that today. The oppression of the peasants was endless. For example, in around 1300, the king passed a law that every resident of France had to buy a certain amount of salt every year, regardless of age or situation. And he set up salt distribution warehouses, if you want to call it that, in each canton. And he set up a minister to handle that business. If the minister was a buddy of the king's, he could get salt at a lower price and sell it to the people in his canton at a lower rate than an adjacent canton that whose minister may have fallen out of favor with the king, and the king punished him by raising the prices. And so a smuggling system arose from the lower priced cantons to the higher salt price cantons, which may have been adjacent to each other or several miles away. But the smugglers were generally the women. They wore voluminous skirts in those days, and they would hide the illicit salt underneath their skirts. There's a road near Rugy called the Hanging Road, where gibbets were permanently set up, and if they got caught, they were hung. This law wasn't repealed until 1942, as I recall. Of course, the other thing that never ended, year after year, and century after century of wars and groups of disbanded soldiers with out work, roaming the countryside, raping and stealing whatever they could steal, and inevitably burn the villages. The huts were all grass-thatched roofs and immediately caught on fire, and so villages were constantly being burned by these outlaws, and there wasn't any law to subject them to, so they got away with it. And of course, they had difficulties between villages too. I've selected a page out of the Abbott's History of Mouse Valley to illustrate one of the events that happened at Rugy. The 25th of February, there was a persistent attack on the barricades of Balassams, and our response was to take our swords as far as the doors of Langres. The 15th of May, the garrison de Siki advanced and burned the church at Androsry to take the refuge of the people that were there. And we eliminated 12 persons and shot 3 others. 12 days after this violent and bestial act, we stole the beasts of Dame de Luanville and part of those of Bourbon. The soldiers of Saint Remy and those of Dimancheville battled with the inhabitants of Rugy, Mézières, Horts, and Rosay on the 30th. 6 of these enemies rests under the ground. In addition, a great number were massacred and so on. These battles were between villages within a dozen miles of each other in a surrounding area there, and they were deadly enemies, and I suspect that this particular one was due to religious matters between the Protestants and the Catholics. If you read the book, you'll get a real background, a real picture of what life was like during these centuries. The region has been endlessly invaded by Hungarians and Germans and Swedes, and of course the Attila the Hun is probably the most famous one, or infamous one, but the Romans, Visigoths, the English, the Hungarians, the Normans, the Germans, the Saxons, the Moravians, and if you can think of any more, Spanish, it's just an endless list of people who lusted for that country, that beautiful. It is an incredibly beautiful farming country, and of course the grapes that are so famous are just grown adjacent to area and to the south of Rugy. It's paid the price for its beauty over the endless centuries. In spite of all these invasions, unquestionably the most important and influential of all were the Romans. Before that, around 52 BC, Caesar had established major headquarters at Besançon, which is about 40 miles southeast of Rugy, and
really applied full force of his armies through the whole region there, including Urgi. The Sequani tribe, which I think is the group that our ancestors, or my ancestors, belonged to, joined with other tribes to form an opposing army against Caesar. And after about 6 years of bitter fighting, the leader of the tribes, Vercingetorix was his name, was forced to take a stand at a hill about 60 miles west of Urgi. The Roman army surrounded him and eventually subdued him after a long bitter battle and captured Vercingetorix and took him to Rome and imprisoned him in the Temple of Jupiter there. And upon Caesar's return to Rome as the emperor, it took several years to accomplish this trick, but anyway, when he entered Rome, he had a victory parade, which was typical of all emperors. Vercingetorix was one of the primary exhibitions during that parade. But after the parade, Caesar had him strangled in the Temple of Jupiter in front of the whole mob of Romans there. That ended the resistance against the Romans in Gaul. The capture of Gaul by Caesar was traumatic to the people living there because of the bloody warfare that ensued for about 9 years. But the long-term benefits were substantial because the organization that the Roman Empire brought to Europe, their laws, their roads, it became universal over a wide area. Well, all of civilized Europe essentially came under Roman rule and Roman authority and order. And while the laws were strict and applied liberally, the order and unification of the various regions that were widely dispersed yielded a supply of aid and food during times of crisis. Certain sections of this vast empire would suffer droughts or various difficulties in the food production, too much rain perhaps, or whatever, while others had a surplus. And so the well-connected roads and communication between Upper England and France and all through the Middle East provided a source of food in time to prevent famines. And so during the Roman Empire, the word famine wasn't known among the population. The government was organized and efficient to the point where they could prevent that. And upon the collapse of the Roman Empire in roughly 475 to 90, it wasn't an overnight collapse, but it was a gradual decay during that century. But law and order disappeared. The unification of the empire fell apart, and the various tribes scattered about this vast empire consolidated within themselves. And so over a period of time then, villages adjacent to each other actually had a language change from what was commonly known in Roman times to dialects specific to that region. Not only that, but the laws changed and they weren't applicable from one area to another. And so if you were arrested in, say, Paris, and you were from Rougy, 300 miles away, the laws in Paris were entirely different, and they applied to you in a way compatible with the locals. So it was very difficult to get justice in anywhere, really. The training and the laws were not clearly written or enforced because it was more prone to a local leader who had his own ideas and political aspirations. So things became very chaotic and very difficult for the population, and famines became very frequent, and it seems as though the weather became unfavorable too as time passed. And during the Middle Ages, they called them the Dark Ages, it was really a very, very difficult and terrible time. And of course, the poor suffered the worst. In 1640, a professor in Paris decided to try to find the cause of a centuries-old plague that had afflicted the peasants of France and regions around there with a fatal disease that was called St. Anthony's fire.
The victim felt as though his whole body was on fire. Because the peasants thought that the infestation came from heaven, they blamed it on St. Anthony, because he was known for the fire of the Holy Spirit within him during his preaching. It was a terrible disease, and it happened sporadically. It wasn't annual, or there wasn't any way they could predict when they were going to be afflicted by it, but when it happened, it spread over the large regions at the same time without apparent person-to-person contact. When the patient acquired this disease, his feet and hands were the first ones to be attacked, and they turned black and withered up and became gangrenous, and it gradually spread over his whole body. His painting shows a victim with the typical terminal signs of this disease.
This is a painting by Matthias Grunewald of a patient suffering from egotism.
The strange part about this disease was that the rich were never afflicted with it, that it only affected the poor. It was well known that the rich only used flour made from wheat, which was a far better material for bread. The peasants couldn't afford wheat, so they used rye, which was a cheaper and less appetizing grain. It also affected the mentality of the patient. They became irrational and violent, or certainly not normal. It was 100% fatal. After several years of study and investigation, he determined that the rye grain that was being grown by the peasants for conversion into bread flour would develop a fungus after a particularly wet and rainy summer. And this fungus then, of course, was part of the grain that was ground up for the flour that the peasants used to bake their bread. And of course, when they consumed the bread, apparently the baking heat didn't affect the pathogen in the fungus. When they ate the bread, then, of course, they became infected. Bread was a staple, particularly in the peasant family, and the whole family could come down with this fatal disease and be wiped out. He also discovered that if a lapse of a year was allowed between our rye crops, then the pathogen would die out. The pathogen had to be regenerated every year, and the rate of growth was dependent on how much moisture it got during the summer. So he proposed a very simple solution, and that was simply to rotate the crops. The peasants had an ancient custom of planting the same crop in the same place year after year after year. When he proposed a radical change in the way they did their agriculture, it was absolutely rejected. The peasants were not known for their openness to suggestions of changing the way they lived. That's the way their fathers and ancestors did it, and then that's the way they were going to do it too. And the rationale behind that is not absurd. If they made the change and the crop failed because of the change, they faced starvation or famine. Peasants lived from year to year, and their survival was dependent on the crops that they were able to produce each year. And any failure was a disaster. So this idea of rotating crops was not accepted for over 200 years. And when it was finally accepted, this disease, this ergotism, as they called it, disappeared. Various accounts of the missionaries who left Ireland in the 600, 800 AD time frame and went to Europe to evangelize the pagan population there still exist. The Druids, who had control of the religious aspects of the population of Europe in those early times. The missionaries penetrated as far as Rugi and evangelized the population. I can't imagine how they had the courage to penetrate into these really pagan people who didn't hesitate to offer human sacrifices, and how they were successful in converting the minds and the spirits of the population. They must have had spiritual powers that convinced the people of the reality of our Lord and the Holy Spirit. It's not known when, with any great deal of certainty, because the records are non-existent essentially, when Christianity invaded our region. There are numerous anecdotes of going back to 6 AD, but those are certainly speculation. According to Gregory of Tours, paganism still had its many followers at the end of the 6th century, despite the sweeping conversion of the population to Christianity. So that's a known date, and probably happened
in various places that gradually congealed into a more universal belief. But none of these tribulations were new or something that their ancestors hadn't suffered, even to a greater degree. Around the time of Caesar, there were numerous authors that wrote histories, including Caesar himself. But I want to read just a few excerpts from a couple of these. I'll start with Caesar. He was a prolific writer. Caesar said that the Gauls loved wine so much that they would trade a slave for a jar of wine. And at the time of Caesar, the grapes were not predominant in France because of the temperature of the weather. But he further commented that most of the common people are groaning under the hand of the powerful and are treated as slaves. They never act on their own initiative, have no choice in public affairs. He further commented that most of the common people are groaning under the hand of the powerful and are treated as slaves. They never act on their own initiative, have no choice in public affairs, and are burdened with debt and crushed with taxation, and groaning under the hand of the privileged classes. He also said that husbands have the power of life and death over his wife and children. Social standards in those days were a little different than they are today. But another author, whose name was Tacitus Silvius, who was a Roman too, he wrote about Caesar after Caesar was dead. And he says that Caesar marched into the land of the Sinuani and laid waste to their territory, completely defeating them. However, Rome was taught a lesson by this ferocious resistance and got some of their captivity modified and relaxed a little bit. It's estimated Caesar killed over 1 million Gauls, women and children, and of course soldiers. I want to read an account of the famine of 1315 to 1317 that affected all of Europe and left men dying, according to the chronicles of Frederick IV of Castile. Now this is a contemporary with these events. He says that the famine was so deadly that a quarter of the population died, and bread made from wheat and grass was commonly eaten for nourishment. Reoccurring riots and revolutions were ruthlessly put down by fearful nobles, and great many instances of starving rebels were summarily executed. Erosion of farmland and starvation of large farm animals caused severe shortage of manure, commonly known as fertilizer. Lack of sunshine hindered the production of salt by evaporation, leading to radically increased prices and drastic shortages. To their burdens, the oppressive salt tax, gabeau as it was called, was enforced. Consequently, the conservation of meat as well as the health of large animals which require salt in their diet seriously deteriorated. Most of the half-naked poor only had a knife as an eating utensil, and in many cases it was the only inheritance of their children. Few had spoons and none had forks. Before Columbus reached the West Indies, the Old World had no corn, squash, tomatoes, pickles, potatoes, or peppers. Anything that wasn't eaten fresh was smoked, dried, salted, fermented, or pickled. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, or other seasoning was not locally available and far too expensive for any but the nobility. Cooking and baking was done in a communal village oven. The diet, according to Gregory of Tours, was grape pips, hazel flowers, fern roots, periodically available oatmeal, eaten without milk, salt, or sugar, heavy gray bread, and occasionally homemade beer, all accompanied by common field grass. Meat and salt were rarities, sugar or sweets were never served, and poaching in the forest of the seigneur abbey was punishable by blinding and or long imprisonment in the hulks, which were rotting ships anchored along the seacoast where prisoners were kept secure by having an iron collar riveted around the neck and arm and a cannonball fastened to the right ankle. A license was required to gather firewood, another impediment in the bitter struggle to remain alive. The following description of a meal at Duke Philip's palace in Dijon, which is only 40 miles south of Rougy, illustrates the polarized lifestyle of nobles and peasants. The author Otto Cartier, The Court of Burgundy, records that, and I'm going to read this account here of a meal at the Duke of Philip's palace, only 40 miles from Rougy, in the midst of starving population. Otto Cartulaire records that Duke Philip, not unacquainted with the finer aspects of exquisite cuisine, which would have been an Epicurean's paradise. Duke Philip himself submitted unconditionally to the laws of etiquette and demanded a like submission from the highest to the lowest of his servants. The napkin which the prince dried his hands was kissed when the sommelier delivered it. In the same way, the valet servant touched his lips to the handle of the 2 large knives which were laid at the duke's place. The fruiterer, in like manner, kissed the torch which was intended for the ruler. Bareheaded, the valets and pages carried the dishes from the kitchen to the dining hall, and knelt frequently before the prince. The manner in which the various articles were to be held was carefully prescribed. The salt cellar between the foot and the griddle, the drinking vessel at the foot. Food and drink were brought in solemn procession. All eyes were upon the prince. A nod sufficed, and when the cupbearer presented the gold, jewel-encrusted cup to the table, he held it high above his head so that it would be untouched by his breath. When the prince had finished drinking, the cupbearer received it with great reverence. A buffet was close by, the 6 shelves of which were loaded with gold and silver service and crystal and glass of all colors and shapes, studded with pearls and jewels. On the table lay cloths of soft damask, reaching to the floor, and on the benches were cushions with embroidered coats of arms. At the extreme end of the golden fountain spurting water had been erected. 28 musicians played while 42 courses of meat and other foods were served. At the end, golden bowls of spices encrusted with jewels were passed to the guests. Some choice dishes demanded by nobility include the superiority of chicken drowned in wine, rather than killed the usual way, of game caught in mild weather rather than cold, of fruit plucked while the moon was on the wane, and the delight of being served roasted peacock with its full plumage displayed. Recent analysis of skeletal remains discovered in Lorraine, a few miles east of Rougy, not only show evidence of violent death, but of atrophy, rickets, and serious vitamin deficiencies. Of course, leprosy was also predominant in these times, but the Black Death that started in 1349, which was called the Grand Mort de la Peste Noire, the Great Year of the Black Death, in the Rougy region. The plague took 2 forms. Pulmonary, with spitting up of blood, bringing death in 3 days, or bubonic, covering the body with running pustules and carbuncles, and death in 5 days. Multitudes died without being buried. A Viennese chronicler wrote in 1354 the following: Neither relatives, nor friends, nor priests, nor friars accompanied the dead to the grave, nor was the office of the dead recited. No bells were rung, and nobody wept, as everybody expected to soon join their loved ones, and believed that this was the end of the world. In many places in the city, trenches were dug, very broad and deep. Into these, bodies were thrown and covered with a little earth, and thus layer after layer until the trench was full. And I, Jean Detroit, with my own hands, buried 5 of my own children in a single trench, while many others were doing the like. Many were dug up by dogs who dispersed their limbs throughout the city, and consorting with the sick or merely touching their clothes meant certain death. Mine own eyes have seen dogs who in a brief time died after touching or eating part of the dead. I'm just going to read one more thing. One chronicler stated, "The peasants are like men walking around in a pond with water up to their noses, and the smallest depression causes them to drown." In 1397, a tax roll showed that 83% of the hearths, which means household, were classified as miserable or not subject to taxation in the region of Dijon, 40 miles south of Rougy. From the Acts of Comte de Champagne in 1397, he's talking about Rougy, the village, and he said, "In the past, Rougy has suffered various degrees of devastation, but by the end of the conflict of 1397, Rougy had been burned to the ground once more." I think that's enough of contemporary information to give you a flavor of the life of our ancestors. And because it's specific to Rougy does not mean that it didn't occur on a broad scale throughout Europe during thousands of years.
It's obvious that this little recitation is not even a drop in the Pacific Ocean of the history of Europe and the troubles that have existed there since, since the beginning of time. But I think an event at the end of the 18th century sparked the fundamental decision to grasp at the opportunity to move from France to the United States by my ancestors and, of course, millions of others. In the year 1792, the revolution broke out in France. But, of course, it wasn't a spontaneous, suddenly happening thing out of the blue. It had been building up for a long years and years. Resentment against the church, against the king, and against the brutality and unfairness and heavy taxation and the suppression of the population, not to mention the natural events that swept through and decimated the population. But in the late 1780s, the weather was bad and the crops failed, and the bread that was available in Paris, the center of the revolution, was diluted with lime dust in order to extend the volume of bread produced. But the baking process couldn't eliminate the wet, slimy results, and the cost of the bread went up, and it was in short supply to begin with. So there was just a turmoil of resentment that was just ready to break at any given spark. And the events in the United States had a substantial amount of influence on the population. Our revolution in 1770 and the years surrounding that date, our freedom was gained by revolution, by violence, from this oppression that wasn't anywhere near as bad as the population of France was suffering and had suffered for a long time. But the idea that freedom could be gained by revolution, and our example of that, and our friendship with France, political friendship, all was in the pot, but it was a fairly large ingredient in firming up the revolution to try to improve their lives. There was a lot of resentment against the church in those years too, because the church, for example, Rougy was owned by the Cistercian monastery, and of course they had to pay tithes to the monastery, and the monastery owned the village and controlled every motion. The people couldn't even pick up dead sticks from the woods without permission, and if their cattle strayed on the wrong property or the wrong boundaries assigned to each of the farmers, there were severe penalties. They even had to pay taxes to cross a little bridge to go to the next farm, and the tithes were a real burden. It was just a real mixture. But the trigger was the Bastille. The king had imprisoned some popular people, and the spark was ignited. The uprising resulted in the total destruction of this monstrous stone edifice that was known for its cruelty to its prisoners. It was torn down stone by stone by angry mobs over a couple of days, and of course many were killed. And in any case, the revolution was led by anti-Christian men, Robespierre, and you need to read the history to get more detail. I'm not going to try to recount the details here, except that it was led by anti-Christian people who turned against the church. The church had its serious faults too. The church was not totally, as the church had been doing assigned sacred work, the people wouldn't have turned against them. But as it was, many thousands of priests were murdered or sent to the hulks and left to die there in these terrible conditions. Revolutionaries changed all the church services. You couldn't get married in the church anymore. I have documents recounting marriage ceremonies, and they had to be held in the commune house of each village, and the mayor was the officiating person rather than the priest. And these marriages were all documented by hand, and all the visitors and the celebrants were all well documented. It was a treasure trove for me to get my hands on a whole number of those relating to the Rugis. Service had to be invented of some kind of a little ceremony to honor and confirm the business at hand. So in one case, I have a record of the couple being required to go out to the front door of the building and shout up and down the street that they were married. And that sealed the deal, I guess. It became dangerous for priests to say Mass, or people to stand up and objection. The revolutionaries even brought prostitutes into the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris and performed obscene acts. I'm going to not describe any more events that happened there. I've written a couple of books, Survival and the Long Journey, that go into quite detailed descriptions of the events that happened. But the fallout after Napoleon's downfall continued. The economic situation was terrible, and the rise and fall of various leaders and kings in the government there at Paris, and periodic flare-ups of revolts and civil wars on a much smaller scale, but nevertheless were sufficient to upset the economy even further, led to more suffering by the common people. And when the opportunity came to move to the United States and own property in the United States, our ancestors, and as I mentioned, many more took advantage of it. And so I guess I owe a debt of thanks to the revolutionaries laying the groundwork for an eventual transformation from French living to living in a wilderness in the central part of Pennsylvania in 1835. Well, thanks for watching this far, but I think now we'll go to the next video.